Picture a room so quiet you could hear a man's pride breaking. It is the Polo Lounge at the Beverly Hills Hotel, Tuesday evening, March 14th, 1961, and there are 47 people in that room. Some of the most powerful names in the American entertainment industry are seated within 30 feet of each other. Agents, studio heads, a sitting senator from Nevada, 2 Oscar nominees still riding the high of their nominations. And at a corner table near the east wall, half hidden behind a bottle of Jack Daniels and a cigarette he hasn't lit yet, sits Frank Sinatra. He is being humiliated in front of all of them. The man doing it is 6 feet 1 inch tall. He has a contract worth $280,000, more than Sinatra's last 2 film deals combined. He is standing at the edge of Sinatra's table, not invited, not asked, speaking in a voice just loud enough to be heard 2 tables away. His words are not shouted. They don't need to be. The damage a whisper can do in a room full of the right witnesses is immeasurable. Sinatra doesn't stand. He looks at his glass. He turns the glass slowly, like a man weighing every option he has left, and finding each one lighter than the last. Nobody in the room moves. Nobody except one man, seated 12 feet away, who has said nothing since he walked in. A man who ordered water, who hasn't touched the menu, who has been watching the east wall with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who already knows exactly how this story ends. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. This is that story. To understand what happened in the Polo Lounge that March evening, you need to understand who Frank Sinatra was in 1961. Not the legend, not the icon, but the man sitting in that specific chair on that specific night. Sinatra had turned 45 in December. He had just come off Can-Can and Ocean's 11, both profitable, neither quite as powerful as the machinery around him suggested. The Rat Pack was at its peak. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, and Sinatra himself holding the center like a fist around a microphone. The Kennedy inauguration had been 9 weeks earlier. Sinatra had organized the entertainment. He had stood in the cold Washington air believing, as he'd told Peter Lawford 3 separate times, that he had finally arrived at the place where nobody could touch him. He was wrong. The man now standing at his table was named Carl Bremer. Not a household name, but in the specific corridors of power that mattered in early 1961, Carl Bremer mattered very much. He was a talent agent operating under the banner of General Artists Corporation, one of the 3 agencies in Hollywood with genuine leverage over television network scheduling. He was 38 years old, 6'1", 195 pounds, with the kind of broad-shouldered confidence that comes from never once having been wrong about a bet. He had signed 14 acts in the previous 2 years. 11 of them were currently on network television. His close rate in negotiations was spoken about the way fighters spoke about left hooks, with a specific, grudging respect. Bremer had a grievance with Sinatra that went back 8 months. In the summer of 1960, Bremer had brokered what he believed was a handshake agreement. Sinatra would headline a television special for NBC, a 90-minute event built around the Rat Pack, to air in February 1961. Sinatra had agreed in principle. Then Sinatra's office had gone silent. The special was quietly given to another network, repackaged with a different producer, and scheduled without any acknowledgement that Bremer's groundwork had made it possible. Bremer lost his commission. More than that, he lost face with the network executives he'd spent months cultivating. He'd been carrying that 8 months of quiet fury into every room since. And tonight, someone had told him Sinatra was in the Polo Lounge. The Polo Lounge in March of 1961 was not simply a bar. It was the operating theater of the Hollywood deal, the place where the informal architecture of the entertainment industry was built and dismantled over drinks that cost 4 times what they should. The booths were positioned to be seen. The lighting, warm and amber, was specifically calibrated to make everyone look like they were doing well. The maitre d', a Frenchman named Edouard, had been there since 1952 and knew the seating arrangements of power the way a chess player knows the board. Who sat near the door, who needed the corner, who required the sight line to the entrance so they could watch who came in without appearing to watch. Sinatra was in a corner booth with 2 men, his road manager, Hank Sonicola, and a songwriter named Jimmy Van Heusen, who had written All the Way and Come Fly With Me, and who Sinatra treated with the particular warmth he reserved for people who understood music at the molecular level. It was a Tuesday. The room held 47 guests, per Edouard's count. The house was at 78% capacity, which was high for a Tuesday in March. There were 6 members of the press in the room, though none of them were covering Sinatra that evening. They were there for the senator from Nevada, who was in a separate booth near the bar. Bremer had walked in at 9:47 p.m. He had been directed to his table. He had sat for 11 minutes. And then he had stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked to Sinatra's booth without being invited. The words he used are not recorded anywhere in the official Hollywood record. They don't need to be. The people who were present, 6 of whom would later describe the scene in separate interviews over the following 30 years, were unanimous in their account of what Bremer's voice communicated. He was not screaming. He was precise. He was listing specific transactions, specific dollar amounts, specific promises he believed had been broken. He had numbers. He had dates. He spoke in the controlled, modulated tone of a man who had rehearsed this confrontation many times and was now delivering the performance of it. And Sinatra, Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, the man who had commanded stages in front of 20,000 people, was sitting very still and staring at his glass. Not from fear, not from shame, from the particular paralysis that descends on a man when he knows that the other person is not entirely wrong. But here's where it changes. Because 12 feet away, at a table near the south wall, a man who had ordered water and hadn't touched his menu was listening to every word. John Wayne had not planned to be at the Polo Lounge that Tuesday evening. He had been on the Paramount lot since 7 that morning, reviewing location scouts for a picture that would eventually become the man who shot Liberty Valance. Though at this stage in pre-production, the casting was still not fully settled and the production timeline had already shifted twice. Wayne had spent 11 hours looking at photographs of Texas landscapes, arguing with a cinematographer about the viability of natural light in afternoon desert shoots, and eating a lunch that consisted of black coffee and half a sandwich. He was in working clothes. A dark green shirt, open at the collar. Wool trousers. Boots that had been resoled twice and showed it. He was 53 years old. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 220 pounds. And at 53, those 220 pounds were distributed with the particular economy of a man who had spent 3 decades on horses, in water, on desert location shoots in 115-degree heat. His hands were the first thing people noticed. Not aggressively, but as a fact, the way you notice the height of a doorframe. They were hands that had been doing real physical work since he was a teenager loading trucks on a USC scholarship he couldn't quite afford to keep. He had come to the Polo Lounge at the request of John Ford. Ford had called at 6 that evening and asked Wayne to meet him at 9:30 for what Ford described as a conversation about Jimmy Stewart that I can't have on the phone. Wayne had arrived at 9:22. Ford had not yet arrived. Ford was chronically late to everything except set, and Wayne had ordered water and settled into a table near the south wall where he could see the room without being the center of it. He wasn't the center of the room. He was a man in work clothes at a corner table, reading the room the way you read a landscape before you ride through it. He had registered Bremer the moment Bremer walked in. Not because he knew Bremer specifically, but because Wayne had 40 years of reading rooms, and he had immediately recognized the particular posture of a man who had come to a public place to do something private out loud. The squared shoulders. The scan of the room before sitting, not looking for a friend, looking for an audience. The 11 minutes of controlled stillness that preceded the movement to Sinatra's booth. Wayne watched without appearing to watch. He saw Bremer stand. He saw Sinatra go still. He saw Hank Sanicola start to rise from the booth and then, just as quickly, reconsider. Because Sanicola understood that standing up would escalate this in a direction that nobody in this room wanted the press to report. The room had noticed. The room was pretending it hadn't. And that's when the crowd went silent. Because every person in that amber-lit room had just made the same calculation simultaneously. This was not going to resolve itself quietly, and nobody was going to be the one to step in. Nobody, as it turned out, except the man in the green shirt near the south wall who stood up from his table very slowly, with no apparent urgency, and started walking. Wayne covered 12 feet in about 4 seconds. Not fast. Not slow. The way a man crosses a room when he has already decided what he's going to do and sees no reason to perform the deciding. Bremer was mid-sentence when Wayne arrived at the edge of Sinatra's booth. Bremer had been saying something about contracts and professional courtesy and the specific ways in which certain people in this town seemed to believe they were exempt from the ordinary obligations of business. His voice was still controlled, still precise, still pitched at that particular volume that was just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Wayne didn't speak. He stood at the edge of the booth and looked at Bremer. Bremer turned. Here is what Bremer saw. A man 6 feet 4 inches tall in a green work shirt who was looking at him with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who has no interest whatsoever in performing for the room. No anger in the face, nothing theatrical, nothing telegraphed. Just eyes that had stopped moving and a body that had stopped moving and a silence that was somehow louder than Bremer's. Carefully modulated words. Bremer had been in Hollywood for 15 years. He had been in rooms with powerful men his entire career. He was not easily intimidated. But something in that silence, something in the particular quality of it, made him stop talking. The room had already gone quiet. Now it went quieter. For approximately 4 seconds, nobody in the Polo Lounge made a sound. Edouard, the maitre d', would later describe it as the strangest 4 seconds of his 9 years at the hotel. Not because anything violent had happened, because something had been communicated without a single word being spoken, and everyone in the room had received it. Jimmy Van Heusen, seated next to Sinatra in the booth, would describe seeing Sinatra look up from his glass for the first time since Bremer had arrived. Sinatra looked at Wayne's face. Then he looked back at his glass. But the expression had changed. Something that had been clenched in Sinatra's jaw had released, almost imperceptibly, because a man he trusted had just inserted himself between the situation and the escalation. Hank Sanicola started to speak, started to offer some version of let's all just take a breath here. And Wayne turned his head towards Sanicola with a very slight, very quiet shake that meant, not yet. Then Wayne looked back at Bremer. And Bremer's internal calculation, the one that had taken him across this room with such rehearsed purpose, began to shift. Because what Bremer was looking at was not a man who was angry. Not a man who was defending his friend out of loyalty or emotion. What Bremer was looking at was a man who had already completed a process that Bremer was still in the middle of, and who was simply waiting, without any visible impatience, for Bremer to complete it too. That's not a physical threat. That's a question. And the question was, do you actually want to continue this? Here? In front of these people? With this man looking at you? Wayne still had not spoken a single word. In the first second after the silence reached its peak, Bremer did the one thing that Wayne had been waiting for. He made a choice. He didn't leave. He didn't escalate. He stood his ground in the specific, slightly defensive way of a man who has just realized that the ground he's standing on is not as solid as he believed, but who is not yet ready to admit it. He turned his body toward Wayne, fully, consciously, moving from the position of addressing Sinatra to the position of addressing the man who had crossed the room. In the second, Wayne spoke. Not loudly. Not with the cinematic drawl that 45 films had made into a national institution. He spoke in the flat, workmanlike register of a man who has no interest in performance and every interest in clarity. You got your say, Wayne said. Now take a seat. 5 words. The room, which had been holding its collective breath, released it. Not in relief, but in the specific exhalation of people who have just witnessed something they didn't fully expect and are still processing what it means. 2 tables away, a woman in a white dress put down her cocktail glass. Across the room, the senator from Nevada had turned completely in his chair. He would describe the moment to a journalist 7 years later as the clearest demonstration of what he called natural authority that he had ever witnessed in a social setting. Bremer looked at Wayne for a long moment. He was a man who understood leverage. He had built his career on the precise understanding of who held it in any given negotiation. And standing in the amber light of the Polo Lounge at 9:58 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, he understood, with the specific clarity that only arrives in moments you cannot prepare for, that he did not hold it. Not because Wayne was bigger, though Wayne was bigger. Not because Wayne was famous, though every person in this room knew exactly who he was. But because Wayne had crossed 12 feet of room to stand in this spot, and he had done it without hesitation, and without performance, and without a single word until the single moment when a word was required. And that combination, the economy of it, the completeness of it, was something that Bremer, for all his professional precision, could not match. He had brought a carefully rehearsed argument. Wayne had brought himself. And himself, it turned out, was more than enough. Bremer took half a step back. It wasn't a retreat. It was the physical equivalent of recalibration, a man adjusting his footing on new terrain. But half a step back in a room full of people watching is what it is. Wayne watched him take it. Then something happened that nobody in that room anticipated. Wayne pulled out the chair at the table nearest the booth, an unoccupied two-top that had been cleared for the evening, and he sat down in it. Not dramatically, not with any apparent significance. He simply sat down, the way you sit down when you've been standing long enough and see no reason to keep standing. He looked at Bremer. "You got a real complaint," Wayne said. "I don't doubt it. But Frank's heard it. Everybody in this room's heard it." He paused for exactly the length of time it took for every person listening to understand that the pause was intentional. "So what happens next is your call." The room had gone completely still. Not the polite, social stillness of people pretending not to listen. The absolute, irreducible stillness of 47 people who have just understood that they are watching something real. Jimmy Van Heusen would write in his journal that night, a journal that surfaced among his estate papers in 1991, that the silence lasted between 3 and 5 seconds. He described it as feeling much longer. He wrote, "Duke didn't move, didn't blink, just waited, like a man who's been in the desert and knows that patience is the only currency that doesn't lose value." Bremer stood in that silence. And then, with the particular dignity of a man who is choosing his next step very carefully, he straightened his jacket, looked once more at Wayne, and nodded. A single, deliberate nod, and turned and walked back to his table. He didn't look at Sinatra. He didn't look at the room. He sat down, picked up his drink, and became very still. Wayne watched him sit. Then Wayne looked at Sinatra. Sinatra was looking at him. There was a moment between them, brief, wordless, that Hank Sonicola would describe as the kind of thing that happens between men who understand each other without needing to explain it. Then Wayne stood, pushed the chair back under the table, and walked back to his own table near the south wall. He picked up his water glass. He had not raised his voice once. He had not touched Bremer. He had not made a single gesture that could be described as threatening. He had crossed a room and said 16 words and sat down in a chair, and in doing so had done something that 47 witnesses in that room would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately. That's not intimidation. That's certainty. And they are not the same thing. There is a distinction that John Wayne made in multiple private conversations across his career between what he called noise and what he called weight. He talked about it with director Howard Hawks during the production of Rio Bravo in 1959, and Hawks remembered it specifically because he wrote it down. Wayne said, "A man who makes a lot of noise is trying to convince somebody. A man who has weight doesn't need to convince anybody. He just needs to show up." What Karl Bremer walked into that Tuesday evening was not a confrontation with a man who wanted to win an argument. He walked into a confrontation with a man who understood the difference between those two things at a cellular level. Sinatra, for all his genius, for all his stage presence and his command of a room from behind a microphone, was in a situation that required weight rather than noise, and Sinatra knew it, and knowing it was paralyzing him. Wayne didn't rescue Sinatra from the situation. He relocated the situation, moved it from the territory where Bremer's rehearsed precision had the advantage, into territory where something quieter and harder and less articulate operated. The territory where what you are matters more than what you say. Sinatra understood that territory. He'd just lost access to it that evening, the way a brilliant musician sometimes loses access to a song in the middle of a performance. Not because the music is gone, but because the awareness of being watched has briefly made the music impossible. Wayne gave it back to him by removing the need for it. And the reason Wayne could do that is that Wayne was never performing. He was never performing. At 10:47 p.m., approximately 49 minutes after Wayne returned to his table, John Ford arrived. Late as always, wearing his habitual patch and exuding the specific energy of a man who doesn't apologize for his schedule. Ford settled into Wayne's table, ordered Irish whiskey, and the two men began talking about Jimmy Stewart and the logistics of Liberty Valance. At 11:03, Karl Bremer crossed the room. He didn't walk with the earlier purposefulness, the squared shoulders and the rehearsed intent. He walked with the particular directness of a man who has spent the last hour making a decision and has finally finished making it. He stopped at Wayne's table. He looked at Ford briefly, an acknowledgement, and then he looked at Wayne. "I need to say something," Bremer said. Ford, who missed nothing and pretended to miss everything, became suddenly very absorbed in his whiskey glass. Wayne looked at Bremer and waited. "What I did over there," Bremer said, "wasn't about Frank. Or not entirely. You already know that." He paused. "I've been carrying something for 8 months, and I brought it into the wrong room." Wayne said nothing for a moment. Then, A man's got a right to his grievance. Not in public, Bremer said. Not like that. There was a long pause. Ford's glass made a small sound against the table. Sit down, Wayne said. Bremer sat. What happened in the next 12 minutes was described later by Ford, in a letter to a friend in 1968, as the clearest lesson in the difference between being right and being wise that I've witnessed in 60 years of watching men figure each other out. Ford, who spent those 12 minutes appearing to examine the grain of the table, was listening to every word. Wayne said, being right and winning aren't the same event. You were right about what he owed you. The room didn't need to know that. He needed to know it. You put it in the room because you wanted witnesses. But witnesses don't give you what you actually want. They just make the other man defensive. And a defensive man can't give you anything. Bremer was quiet for a moment. What should I have done? Called him, Wayne said. Sat across from him in a room with no witnesses. Said what you said tonight, just the two of you. Given him a place to be wrong without an audience. Bremer looked at his hands. Because here's the thing, Wayne continued. Frank didn't break that deal because he doesn't respect you. He broke it because someone put a better deal in front of him at 3 a.m, and he took it and told himself he'd sort it out later. That's not malice. That's Frank. Wayne picked up his water glass. Malice and weakness aren't the same thing, and treating them the same way just makes enemies out of people who were only being careless. Bremer was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Ford committed to memory and repeated in the 1968 letter. 38 years old, 15 years in this business. That took about 40 seconds to understand. Wayne looked at him with something that was not quite a smile. You already knew it, Wayne said. You were just angry. Bremer nodded, the same deliberate nod he had offered before crossing back to his table. Except this time there was something different in it. The earlier nod had been the acknowledgement of a man accepting an outcome he hadn't chosen. This one was the acknowledgement of a man who had just received something he hadn't expected to find in the Polo Lounge on a Tuesday night. He stood. He extended his hand. Wayne shook it, his large, twice-resoled boot hand wrapping around Bremer's, one firm motion, nothing theatrical. Talk to Frank, Wayne said. This week. Just the two of you. Bremer nodded once more. Yes, sir, he said. He walked back across the room. At the east wall, he paused at the edge of Sinatra's booth, said something brief and quiet that only the booth could hear, and kept moving toward the door. Ford watched him go. Then he looked at Wayne. Took you long enough, Ford said. Wayne picked up his water glass. You were late, he said. There is a principle that John Wayne returned to throughout his life. In interviews, in conversations with directors and co-stars, in the private journals that his family has shared selectively with historians. That can be summarized this way. The most powerful thing a man can do in a crisis is arrive. Not speak first. Not make his position known immediately. Simply arrive, with his full presence, with no agenda for performance, and let the weight of his being there do the first work. It is a harder discipline than it sounds. Every instinct of ego pushes toward the word, the gesture, the declaration that announces, I am here and I have an opinion. Wayne spent decades training himself against that instinct. What you see in the Polo Lounge that March evening is the product of that training. Not the natural ease of a man who never had to work at it, but the earned stillness of a man who worked at it for 30 years and had finally, by 53, stopped needing to think about it. Sinatra felt it. Bremer felt it. The 47 people in that room felt it. The room went quiet not because Wayne threatened anyone. The room went quiet because the room recognized something it almost never encounters in the ambient noise of ambition and performance and professional positioning that fills a place like the Polo Lounge. It recognized a man who was entirely himself, entirely present, and entirely without need of their approval. That is a rare thing. In 1961. In 2024. In any year you care to name. Carl Bremer called Sinatra 3 days later. The meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon at Sinatra's offices on the Paramount lot, door closed, no assistants present. What was said is known only through Bremer's own account, shared with his business partner in 1974 and later with an oral historian from UCLA in 1989. He told Sinatra what Wayne had told him, that malice and carelessness are not the same thing, and that a man who treats them as identical makes enemies out of people who were only being thoughtless. Sinatra, by Bremer's account, sat very still for a long time. Then he said, he's right. Then he said it again, quieter. And then, for the first time in 8 months, the conversation that should have happened immediately began. The television special was renegotiated. Bremer received compensation. Not the full original commission. Neither man was pretending that was possible. But enough. More than enough, really, because what Bremer walked out of that meeting with was not primarily a number. It was a relationship that had been pulled back from the edge of permanent collapse. He and Sinatra worked together professionally 6 more times over the next 12 years. Bremer went on to establish his own agency in 1965, operating independently under the name Bremer Associates, which by 1971 had 17 signed clients and a reputation. Specific, talked about, attributed, for the quality of his client negotiations. Former colleagues described his approach: patient, private, never publicly adversarial. Never bringing a grievance into a room full of witnesses when a closed door and a direct conversation would serve better. His associates knew something had shifted in him. They asked about it occasionally, and Bremer was not a man who told the story easily. But in 1972, at a dinner for one of his clients at Chasen's, he told it. The Polo Lounge, the Tuesday in March, the 16 words and the chair and the 12 minutes at John Ford's table. He told it the way Wayne had crossed the room. Without excess, without performance, with only the necessary details. One of the young agents at that dinner, a 26-year-old named Robert Eisner, who would go on to become one of the most respected talent managers in the business by the 1980s, would describe that dinner as one of 3 conversations that fundamentally changed how he understood his work. He would tell the story to his own associates. They would tell it to theirs. Wayne never spoke about the evening publicly. Not in interviews, not in print. It wasn't the kind of story he told about himself. But Sinatra spoke about it once, a single reference, in a 1968 interview with a journalist for Esquire magazine, discussing friendship and loyalty. He said, "There are a handful of men in my life who showed up when I needed it without being asked and without making a production of it. Duke is one of them." That's the whole sentence. I don't need to add anything to it. Years later, the Polo Lounge underwent a renovation. The east wall where Sinatra's booth had been was repositioned. The amber lighting was replaced with something cooler and more contemporary. The table near the south wall, the one where a man in a green work shirt had ordered water and watched a room and covered 12 feet without apparent urgency, was gone. But something of that Tuesday evening had traveled far beyond the room itself. Into a renegotiated deal. Into a young agent's understanding of his work. Into the conversations of their conversations. Into the particular, durable lesson that a man can carry a grievance without making a performance of it. That private is almost always more powerful than public. That what you are carries more weight than what you say. And that the most effective thing you can do when someone you respect is losing ground is not to announce yourself, but simply to arrive. 47 witnesses. 16 words. One lesson that traveled 40 years through rooms that never knew its origin. Return, for a moment, to the opening image. A room so quiet you could hear a man's pride breaking. That's not what the silence in the Polo Lounge was. Now you know what it actually was. It was 47 people hearing, for a few seconds, what certainty sounds like when it doesn't need to speak. One principle. One moment. One man who understood that the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of noise is arrive in silence. And maybe that's the question worth sitting with tonight. In the rooms you walk into, at work, at home, in every place where the ambient noise of performance and positioning fills the air, what would it mean to carry that kind of weight? Not to perform it, not to announce it, just to have it and let it do what it does. But there is one story about John Wayne and the people he kept close. One specific evening that occurred years before the Polo Lounge, in a much smaller room, with a much higher personal cost, that he never discussed with anyone who wasn't there. The people who were there described what they saw only in private. What it reveals about the difference between what Wayne showed the public and what he actually believed about loyalty. That's a story for another time.